Free agency is here, and there is a ton of intrigue about what the Bengals are going to do with all their salary cap space. But not only do I think the Bengals are going to be aggressive, I think there is a specific position that they're going to target first. And in this video, I'll explain what that position is. Hi again, Bengals fans. John Sheeran of A to Z Sports Cincinnati here, and free agency is officially here. I'm recording this actually on the onset of this weekend, so if there's anything good or potentially bad that happens between now and the actual start of legal tampering, we will cover that more in depth when we get to that point, but I just want to get this out here now as we kind of set the stage for free agency. Because before the Bengals actually made any additions to their team, they made some subtractions first. And you're going back a handful of weeks now with the release of Sheldon Rankins. Last week, you saw Alex Kappa get released as well. Sam Hubbard retired after I think officially he was released. So those were the three big cap casualties that we all kind of knew were coming, but they did arrive, I think, earlier than a lot of us assumed that they would. And I think that was a bit surprising considering that this team normally adds players before releasing anyone, even the ones that we assume are going to be released. But I think in this case, it was a clear sign that this team knows what type of players that they want to target immediately in free agency. It's not a coincidence that Rankins, Kappa, and Hubbard were all trench players, right? We know that there's going to be a focal point in addressing both the offensive and defensive line. But if I were to predict the first external signing that this team makes when legal tampering opens, I'm going to put my money on the guard spot. And the low-hanging fruit here, I very much realize, is the fact that the Bengals did this 3 years ago when they signed Alex Kappa in the first place. Remember, that news was reported at 12:01 Eastern Time, literally a minute after legal tampering opened. It was the quickest reported agreement that the Bengals have ever done in the history of free agency. And you would think logically that the very best and the most expensive players on the open market end up agreeing to these deals before anyone else in legal tampering. But clearly, as evidenced by what happened with Kappa and the Bengals, that's not always the case. In that scenario, Kappa was a player the Bengals knew that they wanted to target, knowing that he wasn't going to command the biggest deal and he wasn't at the highest priority for anyone else necessarily, but he was someone that the Bengals knew was going to fit in their price range. They quote-unquote illegally tampered in order to get that done because obviously you're not negotiating a 4-year, $35 million contract in just 1 minute. But they did so because they had a very dire need at the guard spot at the time and they just didn't mess around. And that exact scenario is unfolding 3 years later, and it's only been expedited, I think, because Kappa is no longer on the team. Now, even if Kappa was still here and he wasn't released a week before free agency opens, I still obviously believe that the Bengals would try to upgrade him in free agency and then release him after the fact. But the fact that he's not here and the only guards on the roster right now are Cordell Volson and a couple of guys on the practice squad, that pretty much makes it a dire need for the Bengals to go out and get someone immediately. And I recognize that there are very similar situations going on at both defensive tackle and defensive end. The Bengals have very limited depth at those spots. They don't really have set into starters at those spots either, so it makes sense to go out and get those positions quickly as well. But I think the difference is you have more options at both of those positions on the defensive side of the ball compared to the guard spot right now. Like you've seen guys like Joey Bosa, Jonathan Allen, Draymond Jones all being added to the free agent market because of being released by their original teams, but you're not really seeing that influx of quality players reaching the guard market now. It's very rare that teams are going to release starting caliber guards before free agency. I think the upcoming draft comes into play here as well. I think the Bengals are going to be interested in drafting all three of those positions, but right now it looks to be a lot stronger of a class for defensive tackle and edge rusher compared to guard. And I think other teams in need of a guard are going to take note of that as well. If you need a starting caliber guard, or in the Bengals case, if you need two, you better find one immediately in free agency before the options dry up. So I do think the Bengals have a couple of targets in mind. I think Patrick Mekari of the Ravens is the obvious one. They obviously are very familiar with him, playing against him in the division all these years. Will Hernandez, Evan Brown also makes sense. James Daniels, another guy who's played in the division just last year with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm not going to predict who they sign, but I do think at the end of this day, the Bengals will find a new starting guard in free agency, and it might be the very first move that they open up with.